Welcome back. Thank you so much for being with us here on the show tonight. A little while ago, I had the opportunity to speak to Amy Schneider. They are a writer, but most importantly, and perhaps where the majority of you would know them from, is their very long consecutive streak on Jeopardy. They had the second highest winning streak in Jeopardy history. The only person that has a higher winning streak than them is Ken Jennings, who, of course, you'll know is now the host of Jeopardy! And the reason that I wanted to talk to them in particular is not only are they a contestant from Jeopardy, they're also a transgender activist as well. And we see in particular right now on the political stage the issue of the rights of transgender people being a very hot button and a very widely kind of discussed issue, so to speak. And so, who better to talk to really than someone like Amy Schneider, who has put their position on this issue at the forefront. Obviously, they are a strong advocate, not just for that, but for a number of other strong kind of social ideals and principles as it kind of aligns with the progressive movement. And again, they also wrote a book recently. I mean, they're a very accomplished person. And so I really was looking forward to having the opportunity to speak with them, where I asked them about some of their activism, but also just how it felt to have such a long winning streak on such a popular game show that Americans, but also Canadians, have come to know and love. Here's my conversation with Jeopardy contestant Amy Schneider. Thank you so much for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Oh yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Perhaps let's just start out with the book that you've come out with, entitled In the Form of a Question. Obviously, people who are big fans of Jeopardy, big fans of the show, they've watched you. They watched your, I believe it was 40-game winning streak consecutively. Just how was the decision reached to ultimately write a book? And for people who perhaps haven't read it yet, what can they expect?
Yeah, I mean, once when that streak happened, I had a lot of people reaching out to me with different things, and then one of them was a literary agent that was like, "Do you want to write a book?" And I was like, sure." I've enjoyed writing most of my life. I loved my creative writing classes in high school and things like that. But it was never something I really intended to pursue seriously, because it's a lot of work for very little reward for most writers. But once I had this opportunity to hand it to me on a silver platter, as it were, I was definitely excited for the opportunity. Especially because it was something that, compared to other things that people were reaching out to me about, it was something that could be entirely under my control. People who saw me on Jeopardy saw, I like to think a pretty authentic version of myself, but a pretty limited version of myself. I'm just me answering trivia questions and having these little tiny anecdotes in each episode that are quick and family friendly and everything. It's not that that wasn't accurate, but it wasn't complete, and I really wanted to show a fuller version of myself. And I wanted that, partly just out of, some sort of basic human desire to do that, but also because I recognized that I'd become, to many people, a sort of representative of the trans community. Jeopardy has an older demographic, people who were, raised like I was in an era before trans people were accepted. And I heard from a lot of people that either themselves or their older relatives, that I was the first sort of trans person they'd really kind of gotten to know and understand. And so I wanted to sort of, give to those people sort of more insight onto, what life is like from the inside for a trans person.
And I mean, perhaps you mentioned kind of the trans aspect of things and the fact that you're a member of that community. And I guess it kind of brings me to another question that I had for you, and that is the fact, obviously, a lot of the times, as you mentioned, it is older people who are tuning in, perhaps people who aren't necessarily as familiar, and perhaps have, some questions. And entirely as they are free to do so. Obviously, my show does a lot of coverage of things like politics and what have you, and the presidential race and things along those lines. And it has become, in many ways, a politicized issue. People have been talking talking about it specifically as we're now in an election year in 2024. I guess I'm just curious from your perspective, what goes through your mind? Obviously, the government does have some say in what goes on, but, at least the other end of the spectrum is, the Democratic Party, who believes that it should be solely between, people and their doctors. And so I guess I'm just curious kind of what you make of the fact that it has become an issue that is talked about so much, specifically, as I said again, in this election year of 2024.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, it is, in a way kind of um devastating, honestly, to realize that there are people who are running for office and seeking the votes of my fellow citizens on the explicit argument that they intend to try and, hurt people like me and take away healthcare that we rely on. That's not a pleasant feeling at all, I have to say. But on the other hand, I also look at it as from that sort of longer term perspective. Like I say, when I was a kid, trans people like were not even a concept that people had. There was no need for politicians to campaign against denying trans people health care, the right to use the bathroom of their choice, or things like that, because they just didn't have that right by sort of universal consensus. And so it's only the fact that we've made so much progress that has, enabled that a backlash is possible to exist because there's something to backlash against. And I think too, I think that what I learned from becoming a public figure as a trans person, especially with, as we've discussed a few times, the older demographic, I expected a lot more kind of hostility given the politicization of the issue. And it turned out that, at least in my experience, most people who are kind of supporting these policies aren't doing so out of hatred, aren't doing so out of hostility, but out of sort of ignorance and out of just prejudices that they were raised with, the same way I was raised with them, that they just never really had the opportunity to reconsider. There aren't that many trans people. And if you've never met one, it can be hard to understand. It was hard for me to understand trans people, and I was one. When you're on the outside, it can seem weird and confusing and unsettling when you're used to a world where those sort of complicated questions about gender identity didn't exist. And so, a lot of those people, all it takes is for them to get to know a trans person, get to know the sort of reality of the situation outside of the sort of scary stories that they see on Facebook and hear about online and things like that, to realize that it's actually not that complicated of an issue. Like, trans people just want to be left alone. We don't really have an agenda other than to live our lives and be ourselves. We're not trying to interfere with anyone else. And if you just leave us be, then it turns out there's nothing actually to worry about. You can just sort of like keep doing your thing, let trans people do their thing, and it's not really that scary.